I have walked the ruins of temples long swallowed by the desert, where the wind carries grains of sand like whispers from another age. I have stood beneath the weathered statues of the pharaohs, their stone faces serene, their eyes forever gazing into eternity. And yet, beneath that solemn grandeur, there lies a truth that is rarely spoken, a truth that modern textbooks refuse to touch. This is the truth of the sexual rituals of the pharaohs, ceremonies of flesh and spirit that bound the ruler to the gods, that promised the flooding of the Nile, the fertility of the land, and the very survival of Egypt. These rites were hidden behind the walls of temples where no commoner could tread, where only the initiated might bear witness, and even they spoke of it only in the language of symbols carved deep into stone. It began, as so many things in Egypt did, with creation itself. In the oldest myths of Heliopolis, the god Adam brought the world into being not through war or chaos, but through an act of solitary pleasure. From his own body, through the spilling of seed, life was formed. Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. This was not a tale told for the amusement of children, but a divine precedent. If creation itself was born from a god's act of sexual power, then to rule Egypt was to wield that same power, to become the living Adam upon the throne. And so, in the shadowed corridors of the temples, the pharaoh would take part in what the priests called the rite of renewal. On the night before the festival of Opet, when the god Ammonius would be carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor, the pharaoh was led to the most secret chamber of the temple. There, upon an altar shaped as the primordial mound of creation, he would enact the moment of Adam's self-creation. The walls of these chambers were covered with scenes that to the untrained eye might appear innocent: lotus flowers blooming, birds with outstretched wings, streams of water flowing into the earth. Yet to the priests, every symbol spoke of sexual union, of the joining of male and female principles that ensured the cosmos would not collapse into nothingness. This rite was not performed in solitude. A priestess, chosen from the ranks of the Hemet Netjer, the wives of the god, would stand beside him. She was often the high priestess of Hathor or Isis, trained from youth in the arts of sacred sensuality. Her role was not merely to arouse the pharaoh, but to embody the goddess herself, so that the king's act of creation was not an empty gesture, but a union with divinity. In those moments, the pharaoh was no longer a man. He was Horus united with Hathor, Osiris reunited with Isis. His seed was the river, his breath the wind that would carry the scent of lotus across the fields. The act was believed to call forth the inundation of the Nile, to swell its waters so that the land would drink deep and bear crops enough for the year to come. Yet there was a darker side to these rites, one that is rarely carved in stone. Some accounts, buried in papyri long hidden in private collections, speak of the feast of fertility held every 28th day, when the moon was full and the goddess Hathor's power at its height. On that night, the boundaries between mortal and divine blurred. The king, veiled in gold and lapis, would preside over a gathering of priestesses and chosen noblewomen in the temple's inner court. Wine flowed like water, music swelled from harps and sistrums, and incense clouded the air with the scent of myrrh and blue lotus, a flower known not only for its beauty, but for its intoxicating, dreamlike effect. In this state, the participants would enact the stories of the gods, their movements both dance and ritual, their touch both performance and prayer. To an outsider, it would seem an orgy, but to the Egyptians it was a reenactment of the cosmos itself, where the union of male and female forces was the very engine of existence. And then there is the most secret rite of all, the union of the two lands. This was performed not at the New Year, nor at the festival of Opet, but at moments of crisis, when the Nile failed to flood, when famine threatened, when the omens foretold the wrath of the gods. In those nights, the pharaoh was said to unite not with a mortal woman, but with the goddess herself in her earthly vessel, often his own sister or daughter, chosen not out of desire, but because royal blood was believed to carry divine essence. In this way, the act was seen as the mingling of God with God, a renewal of the sacred bloodline that could ward off disaster. These things are not spoken of in the neat paragraphs of modern history books. The Egypt they present is one of pyramids and battles, of trade and politics, stripped of its heartbeat of ritual and sensuality. But when you walk the silent halls of Luxor at night, When you run your hand across the cool stone and feel the faint grooves of ancient carvings, you sense the truth still breathing there. I have read fragments of scrolls kept in vaults far from public eyes, scrolls that speak of a pharaoh who broke the sacred order of the rites, who took pleasure without offering the proper prayers, who spilled seed without invoking the gods. The Nile failed that year. The harvest rotted in the fields, and the priests whispered that the gods had turned their faces away. What remains to be told is not only the nature of these rituals, but the conspiracies that grew around them, the rivalries among the priests, the secret power of the royal women, and the hidden chambers where truths far more dangerous than any army were kept from the people. For the deeper one looks into the sexual rites of the pharaohs, the more one realizes that these acts were not merely about pleasure or even fertility. They were about control, about who truly held the keys to Egypt's survival. And in the next part of this tale, I will take you further into those conspiracies, where passion and power were bound so tightly that to touch one was to awaken the other. When one imagines the court of the pharaoh, the mind often conjures visions of shimmering gold, towering obelisks, and the deep hum of sacred chants echoing through vast temple halls. But these were only the surface ornaments of power. Beneath them lay a network of rivalries, conspiracies, and silent wars. And at the heart of these struggles was something far more intimate than politics or armies: the control over the sexual rites that bound the king to the gods. In public, the rituals were presented as solemn, divine duties. The pharaoh was Horus made flesh, uniting with the goddess to ensure the prosperity of the two lands. The priesthood stood as guardians of this process, claiming that without their blessing, the gods would turn their backs on Egypt. But what no stone inscription reveals is that the selection of the women who took part in these rites was itself a weapon in the priests' war. The Temple of Karnak, the beating heart of Ammonius' cult, held the greatest influence over these ceremonies. Its high priest, often a man as politically powerful as the pharaoh himself, oversaw the Hemet-Necher, the wives of the god. These women, chosen from noble families, were trained from childhood in sacred dance, music, and the arts of physical union that were considered offerings to the divine. They lived cloistered within the temple precinct, their lives dedicated to preparing for the moments when the king would require their service. But the high priest's control over them made him a kingmaker in his own right. To place one's daughter or sister among the wives of the god was to secure influence that reached directly into the pharaoh's bedchamber during the most mystical and vulnerable act of his reign. It was whispered that some high priests used this to sway decisions of state. Subtle messages spoken in the haze of incense, between sighs and murmurs, when the barriers between the mortal and divine seemed to dissolve. This influence did not go uncontested. Opposing Karnak was the cult of Ptah in Memphis, ancient and proud, whose own priesthood claimed that their god, not Ammonius, was the true creator of the world. They argued that the rite of renewal should be theirs to perform. Their priestesses, they boasted, were descended from the original attendants of the goddess Hathor herself, and their training was said to involve secret techniques lost to other cults. More than once in Egypt's history, a pharaoh was persuaded to travel to Memphis to perform the rites there instead, igniting jealous fury in Thebes. I have read in a fragile papyrus, its ink faded to a ghostly brown, that during the reign of a little-known pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, this rivalry erupted into open sabotage. On the eve of the festival of Opet, when the king was to perform the union in Karnak's innermost chamber, the priestesses of Memphis infiltrated the city in disguise. In the night, they replaced the sacred incense with a mixture laced with blue lotus and mandrake in proportions so potent that it pushed the king into a delirium. In this state, he was unable to complete the rite, and the next day the Nile's waters were measured as low. The high priest of Ammonius declared it an omen of divine displeasure, but his enemies whispered that it was proof of Ammonius' weakness. And here lies a truth that the textbooks never dare to print. The sexual rites were not merely sacred, they were political instruments of staggering potency. A successful ceremony strengthened the priesthood that oversaw it. A failed one could be used to undermine the pharaoh himself. The women at the center of these rites were not passive pawns, though the official records would have you believe they were. Some wielded their beauty and divine status as tools of their own ambition. The most dangerous among them could influence the king's heart, his dreams, and even his policy. One fragmentary stele, long hidden in the storehouse of the Cairo Museum, depicts a figure believed to be a Hemet-Necher named Neferu. She is shown not in the typical submissive pose, but standing equal in height to the pharaoh, a lotus blossom in one hand, a flail in the other, the symbols of fertility and royal authority combined. Scholars debate whether this was symbolic art or a dangerous hint at her true role in court politics. It was also said, though never in writing, only in hushed speech, that some priestesses acted as spies, reporting every word and gesture of the pharaoh during the rite to their temple superiors. From the texture of his voice to the firmness of his resolve in the sacred act, they gleaned insight into his health, his confidence, and his state of mind. This intelligence could be turned to advantage in the endless chess game between the temples. But the most scandalous conspiracy came in the reign of a king whose name I will not speak, for his tomb remains unmarked. In a year of drought and pestilence, when the people cried out for the blessing of the gods, the high priest of Karnak selected not one but 3 wives of the god to attend the pharaoh in the ritual chamber. This was unprecedented. The stated reason was to invoke the triple aspect of the goddess, maiden, mother, and crone, but in truth, it was a gamble to break the famine by overwhelming the rite with divine potency. The gamble failed. The Nile's waters remained low, and the people began to mutter that the gods had withdrawn. It was then that rumors spread of a shocking act, that one of the 3 women had been smuggled into the rite by the cult of Ptah, not to aid the pharaoh, but to curse him. Some claimed she uttered forbidden words into his ear in the moment of climax, binding his seed not to the land but to the underworld. Within months, the king was dead, and the high priest of Karnak was found strangled in his chambers. His death was recorded as an accident. I do not believe it. You see, in Egypt, the bed and the throne were bound by the same golden cord. To control one was to control the other. And the rites of the pharaoh, those secret acts that the public only knew in the form of carved lotus flowers and poetic hymns, were the most dangerous field of battle. But this was only the mortal layer of the conspiracy. For there are tales, preserved in the cryptic writings of the Temple of Dendera, that speak of a deeper power behind these rites. They tell of a hidden doctrine known only to the highest initiates, a belief that if the rite was performed under certain stars, with certain words and gestures, the pharaoh could not only bless the land, but open a gate to the realm of the gods themselves. In the next part, we shall enter that realm, and see how the priests tried to use this gateway of the flesh for purposes that reached far beyond the survival of Egypt. There are rooms in Egypt's temples that even the most learned guides will not speak of. Their doors are sealed, their inscriptions weathered into obscurity, and in some cases their very existence denied. Yet the fragments I have pieced together from papyri, stolen stele, and the whispered words of archaeologists reveal that these hidden chambers were central to a secret doctrine, a belief that the pharaoh's sexual rites were not merely symbolic acts of fertility, but the key to opening a passage between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. This doctrine was not widely known, even among the priesthood. It was the domain of a small circle within the temples, referred to in texts as the keepers of the hidden flame. These were men and women who had devoted their lives to studying the myths of creation in their most unfiltered form, myths far older than the polished stories told to the public. In their teachings, Adam's act of self-creation was not a metaphor, but a moment when the raw forces of the universe had been focused and shaped by desire. To repeat that act with precision, they believed, was to momentarily pierce the veil between worlds. The keepers taught that this was possible only under very specific conditions. The rite must be performed in absolute secrecy, in a chamber aligned with certain constellations. The participants must fast for 3 days, bathing in sacred oils, and the king's partner, always a priestess chosen for her purity of bloodline, had to be anointed not with oil alone, but with a mixture of myrrh, lotus resin, and powdered gold. The culmination of the rite was not intended to be conception in the human sense, but conception in the cosmic sense, the creation of a bridge, a point at which the divine could manifest in the mortal realm. The keepers believed that in that brief moment of ecstasy, when human consciousness blurred and the body trembled, the soul could touch the gods and bring back their blessings or their wrath. In the reign of one little-known but ambitious pharaoh, these teachings moved from theory to practice. The Nile had failed for 2 years. Famine had weakened the people, and the treasury was bleeding from the cost of importing grain from foreign lands. The king, desperate to restore faith in his divine power, turned to the keepers. On the night of the winter solstice, he was led to the chamber of the first dawn, deep within the temple of Dendera. This chamber was aligned so that a shaft of light from the rising sun on the solstice would pass through a narrow slit, striking the altar at its center. The king's partner in the rite was not one of the usual Hemet from Karnak, but the high priestess of Hathor herself, a woman said to have been trained from childhood in the oldest, most secret forms of sacred union. The preparations lasted hours. The king was bathed in water mixed with petals of the blue lotus, which dulled the edges of his thoughts and brought visions. The priestess drank a potion of mandrake and honey to open her senses to the invisible. The air was heavy with incense so thick it seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. When the rite began, the keepers chanted in a tongue older than hieroglyphs, their voices a low, unbroken vibration. The king and priestess enacted the union not upon a bed, but upon a carved slab representing the primordial mound, the place where life had first emerged from the waters of chaos. Every movement followed a prescribed pattern, every touch and breath timed with the rhythm of the chant. And then, as the sun's first ray pierced the slit and bathed them in gold, something happened that none would speak of openly. The scrolls I have seen describe it only in symbols. A serpent coiling through the air, the ceiling dissolving into stars, a voice that was not a voice speaking from all directions at once. When the rite ended, the king was silent, trembling, and for 3 days afterward he refused to see anyone but the high priestess. That year, the Nile flooded higher than it had in a generation. News of this reached Karnak, and with it came fear. For if the keepers could summon divine favor without the mediation of Ammonius high priest, their influence could eclipse the greatest temple in Egypt. What followed was not a battle of armies, but of whispers and assassinations cloaked as accidents. Several keepers died in ritual missteps. Others vanished entirely. The chamber of the first dawn was sealed, and its location omitted from all public temple maps. But the secret could not be buried forever. Generations later, during the reign of a king you would recognize from every schoolbook, the rite was attempted again, but with a twist. The high priest of Ammonius, eager to claim the power of the gateway for himself, chose not a priestess of pure bloodline but a foreign concubine famed for her beauty. She was said to have been brought from the Aegean, with eyes the color of the midday sky and hair like burnished copper. The keepers who remained in secret warned against it, claiming that the goddess would not recognize a vessel outside the sacred lineage. The high priest ignored them. That night, the rite began as before, the fasting, the oils, the chanting. But at the crucial moment, when the sun's light should have touched the altar, a sudden wind blew through the sealed chamber, extinguishing every torch. In the darkness came a sound like the roaring of the sea, and the concubine screamed. When the light returned, the king lay unconscious, his skin cold, and the woman was gone. Her body was never found. The next season, the Nile failed again, and for years the people told stories of a pale woman who walked the riverbanks at night, her eyes like empty skies, her hands dripping water though no rain fell. From then on, the official priesthood forbade any further attempts to open the gateway. Yet I have reason to believe it was attempted in secret many more times, each one recorded only in the cryptic symbols carved into the walls of locked rooms in Luxor and Dendera. The serpent, the mound, the rising sun, and the trembling hand, always the same. And so the sexual rites of the pharaohs were more than the blending of flesh and politics. They were an attempt to use the most primal act of life as a key to eternity itself. But what if those keys were sometimes turned too far? What if, in seeking the blessing of the gods, the pharaohs had also opened their world to things that should never have crossed the threshold? In the final part of this tale, we will descend into the darkest accounts, the failures of the rites, the punishments that followed, and the ultimate reason why the true nature of these ceremonies was erased from history. It is a mistake to think that the ancient Egyptians believed the gods were gentle guardians. They did not. The gods of the Nile were as merciless as they were generous, as capable of bringing plague as they were of granting harvest. To be a pharaoh was not to be the pampered child of heaven, but its hostage. And nowhere was this more evident than in the secret sexual rites that bound king and cosmos together. The keepers of the hidden flame taught that the union between pharaoh and goddess, whether enacted with the high priestess or through ritual self-creation, was an agreement, a covenant. If the rite was performed with purity of purpose and exact observance of every gesture, the gods would renew Egypt's lifeblood. But if it was broken, if lust outweighed sacred order, then the same doorway that could bring blessings could also call forth retribution. And history, as I have found it in forbidden archives, is littered with such punishments. One of the earliest failures recorded comes from the reign of a pharaoh whose cartouche was deliberately chiseled out from temple walls. It happened during a year when foreign armies threatened Egypt's southern borders. The pharaoh, desperate for divine intervention, called for the rite of renewal to be performed outside of its appointed season. The high priest of Karnak objected, but the king overruled him, declaring that he alone carried the god's authority. The ritual began as prescribed, but the chosen priestess was not of the wives of the god. She was the king's personal mistress, selected for her beauty rather than her initiation. Witnesses, and here I quote a damaged papyrus stored in the Bibliothèque Nationale, described a sudden tremor in the temple floor as the act reached its peak. The torches flared blue, the air grew cold, and an unearthly hiss filled the chamber. When it was over, the pharaoh collapsed, bleeding from the ears and nostrils, and the mistress's hair had turned white. She died within days. The Nile's waters, instead of rising, dropped so low that fish rotted in the shallows, and famine took the land. That event became a warning told in the training of every legitimate Hemetnecher, though always cloaked in metaphors about the flower not blooming out of season. But not all failures were accidents of hubris. Some were deliberate acts of sabotage. During the late 18th dynasty, as Egypt's empire stretched from Nubia to the Levant, the cult of Ammonius faced growing rivalry from the Atenists, followers of the solar disk Aten, favored by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. The Atenists had no use for the traditional sexual rites. They claimed the god's light alone sustained creation. To discredit Ammonius' priesthood, they planted a false priestess in the temple of Karnak. This woman, trained in the art of seduction but not the sacred forms, was chosen to partner the king in the annual rite. At the moment of climax, instead of speaking the invocation to Ammonius, she whispered the forbidden name of Aten. What followed was recorded only in the most veiled language. A dark wind swept the chamber, extinguishing every flame, and the statue of Ammonius in the adjoining hall toppled from its base. The king fell into a fever that lasted 40 days, during which he spoke in tongues no one could recognize. When he recovered, his favor for the cult of Ammonius had vanished, and he threw his support behind Aten. The keepers of the hidden flame were purged. Egypt entered a period of religious upheaval that historians still debate, but which temple insiders saw as the curse of a corrupted rite. The most catastrophic account I have uncovered, however, comes from a night remembered in legend as the night the gods turned away. It occurred during the reign of the last great native-born pharaoh before the Persians took Egypt. By then, the practice of the sexual rites had become dangerously politicized. Multiple temples, Karnak, Dendera, Memphis, competed for the honor of conducting it. In an unprecedented attempt to unify these factions, the pharaoh decreed that the rite would be performed with representatives from all three temples in attendance. The chosen woman was said to be of unmatched beauty and descent, carrying the bloodlines of priests from all three cults. She was prepared for months, bathed in sacred waters from the Nile source, anointed with oil pressed from the first harvest of the year, and taught the sacred patterns until she could perform them in sleep. The night of the rite, the chamber was lit with hundreds of lamps, their flames reflecting from the gold leaf walls. The chants began in perfect unison. Ammonius priests, Ptah's priests, Hathor's priestesses, their voices weaving into a single river of sound. The union began smoothly, every movement aligned with the slow rhythm of the drums. But then, in the critical moment when the words of creation were to be spoken, a dispute broke out between the factions. The priests of Ptah claimed the invocation should name their god first. The priests of Ammonius refused. Voices rose, the chant fractured, and the rhythm faltered. The pharaoh, still within the act, shouted for order, but the damage was done. The air in the chamber grew heavy, the heat oppressive. Witnesses swore the stone walls began to sweat. The lamps flickered and went out one by one, until only darkness remained. In that darkness came a sound, not of wind, but of something vast inhaling. Then silence. When the lamps were relit, the woman lay lifeless, her eyes open but empty. The pharaoh was alive but paralyzed from the waist down, and would remain so until his death. That year, not only did the Nile fail, but the eastern desert winds carried locust swarms into the delta, destroying what little grain remained. The people murmured that the gods had turned their backs forever, and within a generation, Egypt fell to foreign rule. After that, the official practice of the sexual rites was quietly discontinued. Publicly, it was said the pharaoh had received new instructions from the gods, that offerings of incense and gold would replace the old ways. Privately, the remaining keepers of the hidden flame burned their records, sealed their chambers, and swore oaths of silence. The knowledge passed into legend, remembered only in fragments of song and cryptic temple carvings. Centuries later, Greek travelers heard whispers of these rites, twisting them into lurid tales of orgies and debauchery, stripping away their sacred and dangerous essence. By the time the Roman historians wrote of Egypt, the true power and peril of these ceremonies was gone, buried beneath layers of foreign misunderstanding. And yet, I have walked the locked corridors beneath Dendera. I have seen the serpent carved into the wall beside the rising sun, the faint outline of a man and woman upon the primordial mound. I have run my fingers over the groove in the stone where, perhaps, the first light of the solstice once touched the altar. And in those silent halls, the air still carries the faintest trace of myrrh. The textbooks will not speak of it. The tour guides will never take you there. But in those shadowed chambers, if you stand long enough and close your eyes, you might feel it. A slow, rhythmic pulse beneath your feet, like the heartbeat of something waiting to be awakened again.